February 18, 1945. A Soviet machine gun team of 8 men crawls through a shattered Berlin suburb, moving between bombed-out buildings. The temperature is -12 Celsius. Their greatcoats are crusted with frost. They're part of the unstoppable Red Army, closing in on Hitler's capital, just weeks from final victory. They've survived Stalingrad, Kursk, the long march west. They're confident, they're veterans, they're loud. Then the first man simply stops. No explosion, no gunshot. He just freezes mid-step, his face locked in an expression of confusion. His comrades think he's joking. They yell at him to keep moving. He doesn't respond. He can't. He's not dead. He's paralyzed. The second man reaches forward to shake him, and his hand locks on his friend's shoulder. His entire body goes rigid. Now 2 men are frozen like statues in the rubble-strewn street. Panic. The remaining 6 scatter for cover, screaming into their radios about some kind of German chemical weapon, some new terror. By the time reinforcements arrive 30 minutes later, all 8 men are standing or crouching exactly where they stopped. It's completely immobile, eyes wide with terror, unable to move, unable to speak. They're not dead. They're alive inside bodies that won't obey. The medics find no wounds, no gas, no poison. Just 8 paralyzed soldiers and a nightmare that makes no tactical sense. What the Soviet command didn't know, what they were about to discover through a series of increasingly desperate encounters, was that this wasn't a weapon in any conventional sense. It was one German soldier, a 28-year-old former biochemistry student who'd been invalided out of regular service for chronic health problems. A man so physically broken the Wehrmacht had rejected him twice. And he'd just declared a private war against the Red Army using a modification so simple, so counterintuitive, that it violated every protocol in the German medical corps. This is the story of Dr. Klaus Reinhardt and the forgotten chemical that let him freeze enemy soldiers alive without firing a single shot. To understand how one rejected soldier could terrorize an army, you need to understand the desperation. By February 1945, Germany was dying. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had maybe 6 weeks left. Berlin was surrounded. The Wehrmacht was shattered. Every able-bodied German male between 16 and 60 was being drafted into the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Old men and boys given Panzerfausts and told to stop the Red Army. Klaus Reinhardt should never have been among them. He'd been a promising biochemistry doctoral student at the University of Heidelberg before the war, researching industrial refrigerants for IG Farben. He tried to enlist in 1939, but was rejected for severe asthma and a heart murmur. He tried again in 1941, rejected again. He spent the war in a reserved occupation developing synthetic cooling compounds for military refrigeration systems. But by February 1945, Germany had run out of soldiers and patients. Klaus received his draft notice. The medical examination was cursory. The doctor barely listened to his lungs. They needed warm bodies. Klaus was handed a rifle he barely knew how to fire and assigned to a defensive position in Berlin's industrial district. He was terrified. He'd never fired a weapon in combat. His asthma made physical exertion agonizing. He knew he'd be useless in actual fighting. But he also knew something the Wehrmacht didn't. He understood cold in ways that military strategists didn't. Klaus had spent 4 years researching a specific compound called dichlorotafluoronuth, a refrigerant chemical that could drop local temperatures to -40 Celsius almost instantly. His laboratory work had discovered something peculiar. At extremely low temperatures, human nerve conduction slowed dramatically. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to cause temporary paralysis that could last 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on exposure. The phenomena was called acute thermal neuropraxia. The cold essentially stunned the peripheral nervous system into temporary shutdown. Muscles couldn't receive signals from the brain. Victims remained conscious and aware, but completely unable to move. Klaus had written a research paper about it in 1943, suggesting possible medical applications. The paper had been filed away and forgotten. Now, standing in a frozen Berlin building with Soviet forces 3 blocks away, Klaus remembered that paper. He had access to industrial cooling systems. He understood the chemistry. And he realized that if he could weaponize acute thermal neuropraxia, he could stop enemy soldiers without killing them. Which suited him fine because Klaus Reinhardt had absolutely no desire to kill anyone. He spent 2 days scavenging materials from the destroyed factories in his sector: industrial CO2 cylinders, refrigerant chemicals, copper tubing, spray nozzles from fire suppression systems. He built something that looked like a flamethrower but functioned in reverse. A pressurized delivery system that could spray supercooled chemical mist in a concentrated stream. His commanding officer found him welding components in a basement workshop. "What is this?" "A cold projector, sir. Sprays refrigerant chemicals at -40 degrees. What's it supposed to do?" "Freeze enemy soldiers temporarily. Paralyze them without causing permanent injury." The officer stared at him. "That's insane." "It's biochemistry, sir. Extreme cold disrupts nerve signal transmission. The effect is temporary but immediate. The regulations don't include freezing people. The regulations also say we should have air support and tank divisions, sir. We're improvising with what we have." The officer looked at Klaus's device, looked at the young man who could barely breathe without wheezing, and made a calculation. "You test this alone. If it works, report back. If you get yourself killed doing something stupid, I'll tell your mother it was enemy action." Klaus tested the device on February 17th, targeting an abandoned Soviet position from 50 meters away. The mist covered approximately 15 square meters, creating an instant zone of extreme cold. He found 3 Soviet soldiers who'd been caught in a previous engagement, not frozen by his device, but killed by conventional weapons. He dragged one body into position and sprayed it with his device. The effect was immediate. The tissue surface temperature dropped from body temperature to -30 in under 3 seconds. Klaus noted that rigor mortis patterns suggested the same effect would work on living tissue. The peripheral nervous system would shut down before core body temperature dropped dangerously low. He reported his findings. His commanding officer was skeptical, but desperate. "Fine. Next Soviet patrol that comes through your sector, you try your freeze ray. But if this fails, you pick up a rifle like everyone else." The test came on February 18th. 8 Soviet soldiers moving through Klaus's defensive zone. He positioned himself in a bombed-out factory with clear sightlines. When the patrol reached optimal range, he opened the valve. The supercooled mist was invisible until it hit water vapor in the air, creating an instant fog. The Soviet soldiers walked directly into it. The effect was exactly as Klaus predicted. Within 4 seconds of exposure, all 8 men experienced complete peripheral nervous system shutdown. They froze mid-motion, conscious but paralyzed, unable even to trigger their weapons. Klaus watched them for 5 minutes, then retreated. He didn't know if they'd recover. He didn't know if the effect was permanent. He just knew it had worked. Soviet reinforcements found 8 paralyzed soldiers and no explanation. The Red Army Medical Corps was baffled. No chemical weapons matched this profile. No toxin caused paralysis without other symptoms. Klaus demonstrated his device to his commanding officer. "It works, sir. Temporary paralysis through acute thermal neuropraxia. No permanent damage. They'll recover in 1 to 2 hours. How many of these devices can you build?" "With available materials. Maybe 5 or 6. Build them. Train volunteers to use them. This stays quiet. No reports to higher command until we know what we have." Over the next week, Klaus built 6 cold projectors and trained 12 soldiers in their use. The devices had limitations. Effective range was only 40 meters. Each cylinder provided approximately 90 seconds of continuous spray. The mist dispersed quickly in wind. But used correctly, in urban combat, where Soviet forces had to advance through narrow streets and building corridors, they were devastatingly effective. The psychological impact was worse than the physical effect. Soviet soldiers started encountering comrades frozen in mid-stride, eyes wide, breathing shallow, completely unable to respond. Medical teams couldn't explain it. Chemical weapons experts found no toxins. The paralyzed soldiers eventually recovered, but they described the experience as pure horror. Being conscious and aware while your body refused to obey any command. The Red Army's advance in Klaus's sector ground to a halt. Units refused to move through areas where the freezing weapon had been reported. Officers who forced advances found their men paralyzed in streets, requiring evacuation and tying up resources. Soviet command started routing attacks around Klaus's defensive zone, treating it like a chemical contamination site. By early March, Klaus had deployed his devices in 14 separate engagements. The official tally was 0 enemy deaths, but over 60 enemy casualties requiring medical evacuation. More importantly, his small section of Berlin's defensive perimeter held while other sectors collapsed. Not because of superior firepower, but because Soviet forces simply refused to advance through zones where they might be frozen. Then Klaus made a critical mistake, submitted a report to higher Wehrmacht command, explaining his device and requesting resources to build more units. The report reached the desk of an SS scientific officer, who immediately classified it, confiscated Klaus's devices, and ordered him to cease all experiments. The SS wanted the technology, but they wanted to weaponize it properly. Kill enemies, not paralyze them. Klaus's device was too humane for the endgame desperation of Nazi Germany. When Klaus protested, explaining that extreme cold exposure beyond 2 minutes could cause permanent nerve damage, the SS officer was delighted. Excellent. Then we increase exposure time. Klaus realized his invention was about to become something monstrous. He destroyed his remaining devices and all documentation. When the SS came to confiscate his equipment, they found only scrap metal and spilled chemicals. Klaus claimed Soviet artillery had destroyed his workshop. He was arrested for sabotage and held in military detention while the SS tried to reconstruct his work from fragments. But without Klaus's expertise, they couldn't replicate the precise chemical mixture and delivery system. The war ended before they solved the problem. Klaus survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, and spent 6 months in a POW camp explaining his cold projector to incredulous Allied interrogators. The technology was classified and filed away. The Americans saw potential applications for riot control. The British thought it might work for non-lethal crowd suppression, but post-war, the world wanted to forget about German innovations, even non-lethal ones. Klaus returned to university in 1947, completed his doctorate, and spent 30 years teaching biochemistry. He never published anything about acute thermal neuropraxia. When students asked about his war service, he'd say he worked in logistics. The 60 Soviet soldiers he'd paralyzed without killing were a secret he carried until his death in 1978. But his innovation lived on in unexpected ways. Modern non-lethal weapons research traces some origins to Klaus's work: directed energy systems that disable rather than kill. Less lethal options for law enforcement. The fundamental principle that extreme cold can temporarily disable an opponent without permanent injury became a pairing foundation for entire fields of non-lethal weapons development. The deeper lesson is about innovation under constraints. Klaus Reinhardt was physically unfit for combat by every military standard. His asthma and heart condition should have disqualified him from service entirely. But those same limitations forced him to think differently about combat. He couldn't outfight Soviet soldiers. He couldn't even breathe properly under physical stress. So he used his actual expertise, biochemistry and cold chemistry, to create an advantage that physical fitness couldn't provide. The Soviet soldiers who recovered from temporary paralysis never knew who or what had frozen them. They told stories about German wonder weapons and secret chemicals. Some claimed it was a new type of gas. Others insisted it was experimental technology from German scientists. The truth, that it was one asthmatic doctoral student with industrial refrigerants, seemed too mundane to be believed. Klaus Reinhardt proved that military effectiveness doesn't always correlate with physical capability. The weakest soldier, by conventional standards, found a way to stop enemy advances without firing a shot. He did it by understanding something the military establishment had overlooked: that extreme cold could be a weapon as effective as extreme heat, and that temporary incapacitation could achieve tactical objectives without the moral weight of killing. His cold projector never changed the war's outcome. Berlin still fell. The Reich still collapsed. But for 3 weeks in February and March 1945. One sector of the city held because Soviet forces were too terrified to advance through streets where they might be frozen alive. That's the real story. Not the technology itself, but what it represented. The idea that the most effective innovations sometimes come from the people doctrine says shouldn't be there at all.